Our program this afternoon features a distinguished panel of speakers. They are as follows. Leah Ackrey is a junior from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, studying psychology and theology. Leah serves as an anchor intern for campus ministry and is an active member of the Native American Student Association. She is a member of the Sikangu Oyate tribe, the Lakota tribe. Kenzie Isaac is a senior from Indianapolis, Indiana, studying sociology, Latino studies, and data science. Kenzie serves as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Student Government. She sits on the Moreau Student Advisory Council, conducts research through Healthy Places ND and the Kellogg International Scholars Program, and serves as a prospective student mentee for the Office of Outreach and Engagement Recruitment. She is passionate about community empowerment and healthcare justice. Kaleem Minor is a senior from Snellville, Georgia, majoring in sociology. Kaleem is a program assistant for relationships and authenticity through the Gender Relations Center and works for the Division of Student Affairs. Through his connections with the faculty and staff at Notre Dame, Kaleem is working to achieve social justice and equity in higher education. He is tremendously dedicated to fostering an inclusive environment for all Notre Dame students. Libby Moyer is a second-year law student from Argos, Indiana. She interns for the St. Joseph County Circuit Court and serves as an assistant rector in Flaherty Hall on campus. Libby is a board member for 25 Women for 2020, an organization that provides training and opportunities for women to become involved in Indiana politics. Libby graduated from Butler University in 3 years with a BS in political science and communications. Our moderator for today's panel is Professor Darren Davis. Professor Davis is a Lilly Presidential Fellow and Professor of Political Science. His research interests include most areas in public opinion and political behavior. A unifying theme running through much of his work is a concern for identifying the social psychological motivations underlying political attitudes and behavior. This approach has been applied to several areas, including political tolerance, implicit racial attitudes, the role of threat and anxiety in political behavior, public reactions to terrorism, social desirability, the measurement of political and social attitudes, racism and racial politics, and the political behavior of African Americans. Our final panelist, a distinguished national advocate for civil rights and a cherished member of the Notre Dame family, is Ms. Diane Nash. At this time, I invite you to watch a brief video about Ms. Nash. At its conclusion, our president, Father John Jenkins, will take the podium to offer a formal introduction.
Courage and conviction reveal themselves in many ways. Sometimes, they even show up in a simple skirt and blouse. Today, Diane Nash joins us after a short drive from her native Chicago, but the longer journey that brought her here began over 60 years ago. It's taken her on foot, by bus, via picket line, and jail cell. As a young woman, she grew up in Chicago's South Side and experienced racial prejudice, but knew of segregation mostly through stories and news reports. Then in 1959, she enrolled at Fisk University in Nashville and felt the humiliation of overt segregation everywhere she looked.
When I actually went south and actually saw signs that said white and colored, and I actually could not drink out of that water fountain or go to that ladies' room, I had a real emotional reaction.
She co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and soon became chair of Nashville's sit-in movement.
And we would practice things such as how to protect your head from a beating, how to protect each other if one person was taking a severe beating. We would practice other people putting their bodies in between that person and the violence so that the violence could be more distributed.
On the front lines of lunch counter sit-ins, she was arrested numerous times. When 2,500 protesters marched in Nashville City Hall and challenged Mayor Ben West, it was the young Diane Nash who made headlines by asking him point blank if he felt discrimination was wrong.
I tried as best I could to answer it, frankly and honestly, that I could not agree that it was morally right for someone to sell them merchandise and refuse them service. And I had to answer it just exactly that way.
3 weeks after Nash's very public conversation with the mayor, the first black customers were served at counters in Nashville. In 1961, she went on to lead groups of freedom riders. They protested the unlawful segregation of blacks and whites on interstate buses. Police often arrested the riders, but they also allowed white mobs to attack them first without intervening. To become a freedom rider wasn't for the faint of heart. When U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy wanted Nash to stop the riders, his assistant was simply no match for her courage and conviction.
Phone in the hotel room rings, and it's the Attorney General. And he opens the conversation. Who the hell is Diane Nash? Call her and let her know what is waiting for the Freedom Riders. I called her. I said, I understand that there are more Freedom Riders coming down from Nashville. You must stop them if you can. Her response was, they're not gonna turn back. Soon I was shouting, young woman, do you understand you're gonna get somebody killed? She said, sir, you should know, we all signed our last wills and testaments last night before they left. We know, but we cannot let violence overcome nonviolence.
Not long after, President John F. Kennedy appointed Nash to a national committee that led to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Today, she is still an active civil rights advocate and has received the Rosa Parks Award, the Distinguished American Award, the LBJ Award for Leadership, the Freedom Award, and honorary doctorates from Fisk University and the University of Notre Dame.
Well, first of all, let me thank all of you for joining us here this day, and thank all of you who joined us last night and this morning for our candlelight prayer service and our breakfast in the dining halls. When we invited Diane Nash to be our honored guest today, she explained that at this point in her life, she was foregoing such invitations. But because Notre Dame had asked, she would make an exception and join us. Notre Dame has received many tributes in its 178-year history, but I can't think of a better one than that. Thank you so much, Diane, for being with us. Diane Nash, as we saw, was present at the creation of the American Civil Rights Movement, leading by personal and courageous example in the sometimes terrifying freedom rides through the still segregated South. Her witness and protest to lunch counter segregation was captured in a photograph that was seen around the world. It documented for all to see the unvarnished fact of racism in American life. Historian David Halberstam described Dr. Nash as, quote, bright, focused, utterly fearless, with an unerring instinct for the correct tactical move at each increment in the crisis, unquote. On her birthday, May 15th, 2016, and I learned it was also her son's and granddaughter's birthday, they share a birthday, Notre Dame awarded Diane an honorary doctorate for her pioneering and continuing leadership in the civil rights and nonviolence. As we just saw in the video, Diane Nash was resolute in the face of intransigence. Her persuasiveness overturned a century of discriminatory practices by the city of Nashville after she talked to the mayor. and we saw how even the White House could not obstruct her path. We heard Attorney General Robert Kennedy's assistant compare Diane to the words of the famous spiritual, "Just like a tree that's planted by the water, I shall not be moved." The next line in the song is equally applicable to Diane. "Sanctified and holy, I shall not be moved." Diane Nash's commitment to justice led her and her companions to risk their lives, endure violence, and be thrown in jail. She never wavered. Let us listen to her and be inspired by her selfless, resolute courage, so that we might become more sanctified and holy. Ladies and gentlemen, please warmly welcome back to the University of Notre Dame, Diane Judith Nash.
Thank you. I am so delighted to be with you this afternoon. This is a marvelous event. 3,200 people, I understand, bought tickets, and I'm sure most of you are attending. I think these kind of events are important. I think they make a community healthier when people come together and experience fellowship for a worthwhile purpose. And I think recalling Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and its importance in our history is definitely a reason to come together. History's most important function, though, is to help us deal with and cope with the present. So I hope that although we commemorate and keep in mind the things that we've done, its most important function is to help all of us cope with the present. I want to introduce you to some people who are very important to me. I brought my own cheering section, and I'd like for you to meet my son, Douglas Bevel, and my daughter-in-law, Ziamara Bevel, and my grandson, Amari Bevel. Could you stand up, please? I had the good fortune of knowing and working with Martin Luther King. He was an inspiration to know. I'm still impressed with his steadfastness, his sincerely having the interests of people at heart, his determination, and his integrity. Plus, I have the distinction of being able to say that I have double dated with Martin Luther King. Martin and his wife, Coretta, and my husband at the time, Douglas's father, James Bevel, went to the Bahama Islands. Martin was working on one of his books, and I have lovely memories of a great restaurant cut into the side of a hill with the moon shining through the palm trees. And as you can well imagine, Martin Luther King was a great person to spend an evening with, socializing. James Bevel who was a tremendous contributor to the movement, said something that I think is important. And it came to mind after the other day when I met someone who was from India, and I asked them, in India, is Gandhi still remembered and revered? And the person said, oh, yes. There are all kinds of holidays and statues and tributes to Gandhi. And I said, and what kind of social change is being pursued using nonviolence? And the person said, well, it's really just like here. No social change, but everybody is reverent and remembering and commemorating Gandhi. And that's a real problem. So Jim Bevel said, you know, the Wright brothers were probably pretty good guys. Wouldn't it have been a shame if we had dedicated a holiday to them and we just praised them and never developed their invention, developing aviation? We'd have missed out on a lot. And I think that that's really true also. We need to not only honor the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, but we need to realize that there's a lot of social change in this country. You have to remember, change needed in this country. You have to remember that Gandhi used nonviolence to gain independence for India from the British Empire. That's something that wars are often fought about. Hot wars, violent wars. And he was able to do that using nonviolence. I think we need to take serious notice, study nonviolence and how to use it. And one last thing. I'm asked very often by young people today when I go to colleges to talk. Questions like, one young lady said, well, how can I make social change and not get my professors angry with me? And my response was, you've got to be kidding. You know, the founding fathers and mothers had a great deal of courage. They actually took up guns against the King of England. If they had lost the Revolutionary War, they would have been executed. Social change takes a lot of work and it takes courage. I told that young lady about the many students in the 1960s who were expelled from school for participating in the civil rights movement. And that's not even to mention those who were severely beaten, who went to jail, and those who were killed. So sacrifice is necessary. Just like the founders of the country needed courage in order to establish a republic, and when Benjamin Franklin said, we have a republic if you can keep it, courage is needed to keep it. Courage is needed to make necessary changes that need to be made today. Thank you.
Dr. Nash, thank you so much again for your appearance here. We really, really appreciate you. I've never met anyone who's been on the front lines of the struggle. So a question that comes to mind is, How do you get youth of today focused on the civil rights struggle and the continuing battle for human and equal rights? How do you get this generation motivated?
You know, very often people ask themselves that question, and I would say you have to start something to give people something to join. If you are not doing something, if you don't have a core group of people organized, even though someone might be interested, there's nothing for them to join. When I first started looking for an organization that was trying to combat segregation, I asked students on this campus if they knew of such an organization, and so many people said no, they didn't. And some said, and why are you trying to get into something like that? You're just going to get into trouble and you're not going to be successful. Why don't you just be cool? I guess today they'd say chill. But I was amazed when a few months later, some of those same students were sitting in and going to jail and marching. And I had to ask myself, well, what made the difference? I think certain personalities are capable of seeing a need and becoming a catalyst to solve that need. Other people will join when there are half a dozen people doing something. Other kinds of personalities will join if there are 20 people doing something. And a lot of people will join if there's a bandwagon. But I think people need to have a vision that something can be done. They have to have a vision of what can be done, and they have to be given something specific to do, like be at Woolworth's at 10 a.m. and sit at the lunch counter. But I think the main thing is to choose an issue that moves you, that you are passionate about, because that passion comes from the same source that created your life. It's not just arbitrary. And learn to use nonviolence. Strategize how you will get from where you are now to achieving the objective that you want to achieve. It's not magic. It's very down to earth and plain. I know when we wanted to get the right to vote in the South, we sat down with a paper and pen and listed the things that we would have to do. Go door to door, explain to people what voting is and what responsibility is. Explain what benefits they'll get if they vote, you know. And then what do we do next? And what do we do next? And what do we do next? And that's how you do it.
So the first thing that comes to mind for me is how physically and emotionally taxing it must have been at times, not only protecting and mobilizing students at such a young age, but also the labor that went into constantly being in spaces where you had to validate who you were and what you were doing in the face of detractors, and you didn't know how they might retaliate. And so my first question for you, and I think this is something that a lot of us at this age could really resonate with, is how did you practice self-care and continue to demonstrate self-love as you went through all of these processes on behalf of yourself and others?
I kind of knew who I was before it started. I think my grandmother had a lot to do with that. She was my primary caregiver until I was 7. And that was because my mother worked full time. And my grandmother would always talk to me about how valuable I was and how I should never let anyone mistreat me. And, you know, we sometimes underestimate our everyday conversations with children. But I can remember thinking, yeah, that makes good sense. I'm not going to let anyone mistreat me. And when I got sent to back doors and humiliated in the South with segregation, it was like, Carrie Bolton's granddaughter can't go through the front door. I don't think so. So that's one thing. And then I'm not sure I was able to do a lot of self-care apart from the movement then, because the movement was self-care. Not to resist being oppressed and discriminated against like that was unacceptable. And not just to me, but that's why you got thousands and thousands of blacks across the South. Segregation was so dehumanizing and horrible that people were ready to move on it. And I would like to say, you know, when you think of segregation, often we think of having to sit at the back of buses or use back doors or not go into restaurants. But that was the surface. That was part of it. But there were serious things. There was no crime that a white person could commit against a black person for which they would be held accountable. There were no blacks on juries. There were no black voters. When a white person, when it seldom did, but when a case would get to court where a white person had killed a black or done something serious to a black person, that white jury had better not convict that white person, or they'd be run out of town. And so it was unfairness against blacks and whites. Black women were almost always raped. They had jobs as a maid or something in a white family. If the man of the family raped them or was inappropriate with them, there was nowhere to turn. They couldn't go. If they went to the police would say, "What are you trying to do? Get this man in trouble? And why would he want you when he's got this beautiful white wife?" And there would be nothing done. A woman, if she went to her husband or to a male relative, she was likely not to do that because if he did try to do anything, it would mean he'd be killed. People had to step off the sidewalk when white people passed. It was just day-to-day humiliation, and it was more than just having to sit at the back of the bus. So I think the movement itself was self-care.
Ms. Nash, in your address to the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice in 1961, you described our individual roles and the role of our church as being concerned with the real love of God and real love of neighbor. At the end of your speech, you said that we need radical goodness to combat radical evil. And I'm wondering, in the heart of this movement, in the heart of the Freedom Rides, and in this movement of active insistence, where did you encounter radical goodness?
Radical goodness? I think it started with Gandhi.
learning Gandhi's religion and philosophy was really important to me. Truth is one of the things that truth, love, and self-suffering were the basis of his movement. And I went to a Catholic grammar school, and we learned the 10 Commandments, and we learned that you should be truthful. And I thought you should, but it was mainly truthful to be good. And I wasn't that moved by it. But Gandhi talked about truth in order to have accurate information upon which to base your decisions. And I was like, wow, that really makes sense. Because if you're not truthful, it's garbage in, garbage out. And I thought further. I said, when, I thought about this later on because it was after 1969. I said, when space, when the scientists were trying to get to the moon, if they added 2 + 2, and sometimes they decided to put down 4, and sometimes they'd put 2 + 2 = 11, and sometimes they'd put 2 + 2 = 1, and wouldn't be truthful, they'd have never made it. And the same thing is true in society. And we have institutionalized lying. Governments lie to citizens. Husbands and wives often lie to each other. Girlfriends and boyfriends lie to each other. People lie in business. It's no wonder that in the natural sciences, we are in the space age or in the computer age, and in the social relationships, we're in primitive stages. So I think Gandhi's influence was the beginning as far as I can trace it back. And Reverend James Lawson was a Methodist minister who saw the possibility of being able to use Gandhi's methods here in the United States, in southern United States. And he traveled to India and studied Gandhi's movement firsthand. And then he brought it back, and fate had it that he came back to Nashville and was in grad school at Vanderbilt University. And he conducted workshops once a week for the Nashville community and whoever wanted to come. And I was looking for an organization that was trying to combat segregation. And John Lewis and I John was already attending them, and then I started attending those workshops. And out of the workshops grew the Nashville Civil Rights Movement.
So Dr. King involved all types of people in the civil rights movement, and one of the reasons the movement was successful would be because it's intersectional. Do you think that approach would be effective today, and what role do white allies have in the continuing movement for racial justice?
I am dissatisfied. Well, I think intersectional movement should exist. But I also think it's important for descendants of enslaved Africans in this country to have organizations and movements of our own. The civil rights movement was a movement of black students supported by black communities to eliminate segregation. We had white support, but it was support. I think our history as blacks has honed our ability to have movements and also necessitates it. I think that it's unfortunate that even though blacks have lived in this country since before it was a country, have contributed as much as we have as slaves, and then after slavery, have had liberation struggle, and still are on the bottom rung of the ladder when it comes to all of the indicators of quality of life. And by that I mean median income, education level, infant mortality, et cetera, even behind immigrants. And I just think it's a big mistake for African Americans to salvage that. White people were really important in the civil rights movement in that they supported us. I think that had we not had white allies across the nation to have economic withdrawals from chain stores where we were holding sit-ins and what have you, that I don't know if we would have been successful at all, but it certainly would have taken us a lot longer. And so those allies were important. But I'm concerned that blacks now seem to have forsaken our own identity in terms of looking at the situation of black communities and deciding how we are going to move ahead. Barack Obama was a result. His election was a result of the voting rights movement in the South. But he came out of a whole different tradition. People in the South who were fighting for the right to vote and who spilled their own blood and whose lives were taken. The idea was to improve the life situation of Jim Crow blacks. Now, I was just chagrined when so much was made of his getting a second term. That's just a whole different tradition that he came out of. And that doesn't mean you hate other people. If you make decisions about your household, if you decide that you need a refrigerator and what kind of refrigerator you need, and only you and your spouse make that decision, it doesn't mean you hate the man across the street because you didn't involve him in that decision, And I think the same is true with the need for blacks to, after all this investment, finally reap some of the benefits.
For me, I'd love to, I think skin color is important. I think it's an integral topic, but we're here from so many different faith backgrounds, so many different experiences. For you, what is the continual role of faith, particularly interfaith dialogue, in moving the conversation that was started by many of the freedom writers forward?
I'm not sure. As I said to you earlier, I'm not an expert in faith. I'm an expert in the civil rights movement, and that's what I can best comment on. I know there were people of many different faiths involved. There were people who were atheists involved, people who were agnostics, and you know, everybody's got their own spiritual path. And if your faith is part of why you are participating in the movement, then, you know, fine, so be it. At the time, I was a devout Catholic, and my faith was an important part of my participation. But I would just say that everybody has to follow their own spiritual path.
I'd like to hear a little bit about how, when you began your tenure as an organizer and an activist, you had to navigate so many different intersections of identity. You were a young person in the movement.
That was what?
You were a young person in the movement, and you were
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry?
Just repeat it again, really slowly.
Absolutely, absolutely. Throughout your time as an organizer, especially when you began, you had to navigate so many different intersections of your identity. You were a young person when you started out in the movement. You were a woman, and to tie all of that together, you were an African American woman. And so I'd like to hear more about how you being young and you being a woman amidst a male-dominated movement, an older male-dominated movement, informed your approach to activism, and what sort of unique barriers or benefits that posed throughout your work.
Well, that's really true, and the civil rights movement came before the women's movement. And it was just generally expected that the leadership positions would be filled by men. I was the third chairperson in Nashville. The first two were men. They missed meetings and missed demonstrations. And when they came back, we said, "Where were you?" And both of them said, "Studying." And we said, we meaning the leadership group of students, said we cannot afford to have leaders who are not efficient because someone could get killed or injured. And so we replaced them. I thanked them for their service and got a new chairperson. I'd say each one lasted maybe 3 weeks, something like that. And I was the third chairperson. I did not want to be chairperson. I was afraid to be chairperson. I declined repeatedly, and the group wouldn't let me decline. Finally, I gave in and accepted. And I remember coming back into the dormitory that night, and the room was dark, and my roommate wasn't home. And I leaned I leaned on the wall in Kathy's side of the room. I felt like I didn't have the strength to turn on the light or walk across the room to my side. And I thought that we would be coming up against white racists in their 40s and 50s and 60s who were businessmen and politicians. And I thought, my goodness, what have I done? In 2 months, which of my closest friends are likely to have been killed or injured? What will happen in the next several weeks? So it was daunting, but it was something we needed to do. Women were very active in the civil rights movement. Women did everything that men did, really. But it hadn't occurred to us that the same things that we were saying about justice and equality in race were applicable to gender. And so after that, I didn't have any trouble being a woman in the Nashville movement because I had been chosen because I was efficient. When the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed, and I was the only woman on the original committee, I want to cough, but I know what it does to the microphone. Excuse me. I had a great deal of trouble there because a number of the young men wanted to get as close as possible to the Kennedy administration. That's how they saw power. I, on the other hand, was struggling desperately to keep the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee independent of the Kennedys because I figured they were the executive branch. It was their job to enforce the law, and if they didn't do it, then we should maintain our independence from them. These other young men made deals like if they would go into voter registration, they wouldn't be drafted into the Vietnam War, which made me hit the ceiling because I did not want SNCC to be beholden to the Kennedy administration. And a lot of the good old boys' activity was against me as a woman. And they'd get right up to the point where I'd say, you know, I'm going to withdraw from this organization because I can't deal with this. And as one of them said, I'd be more trouble outside the organization than in. And so they would backpedal and make enough concessions for me to continue. And then, of course, with Baptist ministers, when I was with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was, you know, the gender problem there. So, you know, the one thing that I had going for me was the Nashville group and success, and they had to respect my work. And so I was able to navigate through it.
Now we have one final question. So thanks again.
Ms. Nash, reflecting on your remarkable work in Jackson, Mississippi in 1961, you educated young people and empowered them towards the movement of desegregation of buses. And you were even faced with the charge of contributing to the delinquency of minors. And I'm wondering, what was that like to take on the role of a teacher in your community? And looking forward, how do you teach civil disobedience?
Well, actually, teaching and organizing was most of our work there. People see the demonstrating and protesting on television and assume that that's what the movement was about. But I'd say that was about 20% of what we did. Most of it was going door to door and having meetings and teaching and what have you. Yes, I was preparing some young people to go on the Freedom Ride. I was 24, and some of them were under 21, which was the age of majority in Mississippi. Because riding in a desegregated fashion was against Mississippi law, then I was charged with contributing to their delinquency because I was encouraging them to break that law. And I was sentenced to 2.5 years in jail. When I surrendered, the sheriff had not realized that I was expecting a baby, and I was huge. And they had just finished with the Freedom Ride, which had focused on Mississippi, and it was a national movement. I don't think they wanted to get into another one. But before I went to serve the 2.5-year sentence, I got on the telephone. I called all the core chapters in the country, all the NAACP chapters, everybody I could think of, and said, I'm going to jail for 2.5 years. Would you consider taking some action? And the judge backed off. He said he wouldn't hear that case. He only sentenced me to 10 days for contempt of court because I would not sit at the back bench of the courtroom. And so I told him when he said he wouldn't hear the contributing to delinquency charge, I said, well, if you let me go, I'm going to go right back to doing what I was doing before. Because I really was prepared at that point, and I did not want him to call at a later time when I might not be prepared. And so he still would not hear the case. So Jim Bevel and I, my husband at the time, we were trying to figure out what happened. And we realized that they had our phones tapped. And they had heard me call everybody in the country and ask them to take, not everybody in the country, but I mean, all the organizations that I did call and ask them to take action. And I think with my expecting a baby and being very pregnant, and they're having realized that I had some backup. It was just more of a public relations situation than they wanted to take care of. I want to say a couple of things since we are approaching the end of our program. I want to talk about the fact that there is a huge difference between protest and a nonviolent campaign. With protest, it's just what it says. You say, I protest this, I don't like this. And no matter how many people you have marching saying that, if that's only going to last a day or two, the powers that be don't really care. They know that a lot they're doing you don't like, and they're determined to do it anyway. With the nonviolent campaign, you set an objective. You write it down. You make sure that all of your constituents are in agreement about the objective. There are 6 steps that you go through and put a community through or a state through or whoever you're working with, the country. And the first step is education, where you gather all the information you think you'll need in order to achieve your objective. You also look at how the oppressed are participating in their own oppression, so that at a later point you can withdraw it. And that's one of the principles of nonviolence. And that principle is oppression always requires the participation of the oppressed. I'll say that again. Oppression always requires the participation of the oppressed. And if the oppressed withdraw their participation from that oppressive system, the system will fall. Now, I need to explain that briefly, and I will. If you take the Montgomery bus boycott, blacks had thought for decades that whites were segregating them on buses. But if you think about it, in order for there to have been segregated buses, blacks had to get on the bus, pay their fare, and walk to the segregated part of the bus. The day the blacks decided there would no longer be segregated buses in Montgomery, Alabama, there were no longer segregated buses in Montgomery. They withdrew that participation. And in the South, we changed ourselves into people who could not be discriminated, we could not be segregated. And so once you do that, the world has to fit up against the new you. And they either have to indeed kill you in large numbers or desegregate. So during that first step of investigation, you gain an understanding of how the oppressed are participating in their own oppression, so you can withdraw that participation during the later stage. We don't want blind followers in a nonviolent campaign, so the second step is you educate your constituency to what you learned, and you're always recruiting new people. The third step, negotiation. You contact your oppressor, let them understand exactly what your objective is, the fact that you love and respect them as a person but will not tolerate the oppression. And sometimes you can solve the problem at the negotiation stage. Not often, but sometimes you can. And often you find out that the oppressor really has some valid problems. For instance, the lunch counter and restaurant owners and managers in our negotiation let us know that they were afraid that if they served blacks at a lunch counter, then no whites would sit down and there would be a boycott by the whites. And we thought about that and we said, well, that's a valid concern because after all, they are here as businessmen to make money. And we decided we could help them with that. And so we recruited some very middle-aged, very stately-looking white women from some of the liberal churches. And those women agreed to sit at the newly desegregated lunch counters. So when a black was served, if some of those women were there, there could not be a white boycott. And that worked very well, except that at the end of this 6-week period, the women complained bitterly about all the weight they had gained, sitting there eating all day for 6 weeks. So you can see there were many types of sacrifices made for freedom back in the day. And then the fourth stage is demonstration. That's when you see the marches and the sit-ins, and the purpose of demonstration is to focus the attention of the community on your issue. And then the last stage is resistance. That's when the oppressed withdraw their participation from the oppressive system. And then the last phase is to take measures to see that the system doesn't reoccur. And you might establish a museum or make a film or whatever you think would best keep the situation from reoccurring. And in close, are we about out of time now? Yeah. I'd just like to say to you students, as you go through life, you will have decisions to make. And my advice would be, always make the decision that will make you admire and respect the person you see in the mirror.
Diane, my job on behalf of all these people and all of us at Notre Dame is to express our gratitude and admiration for you. And just as a token of that, to remember us and to remember that admiration for you, here's just a little photo of the Golden Dome. So just know we're thinking of you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Okay.
I have my honorary degree in a prominent place on my mantle, and this will go next to it.
I'll take care of it.
As we bring our luncheon to a close, I'd like to thank everyone that has worked visibly and behind the scenes to make this event possible. Members of the President's Office, our food services personnel, our Joyce Center staff, and a host of others too numerous to mention. Please join me in giving them a very warm round of applause. I would also like to thank all who have joined us here today in person or by means of our live feed, and invite you to be part of all of our Walk the Walk events in the days ahead. A full listing of those events is on the back of today's program. The takeaway for this year's luncheon is a copy of the university's Principles on Diversity and Inclusion with the iconic photograph of Dr. King and Father Ted on the reverse side. Our own efforts to advance the vision of Dr. King, to bring to full fruition his vision of the beloved community at Notre Dame and throughout the world is, as we all know, ongoing. It is incumbent upon us individually and collectively to enact each day the dream of a better world through love in service to justice. Let us join together in so doing. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Aaron Benavides to bring this luncheon to a close by offering our benediction. He is a junior studying political science, theology, digital marketing, and journalism, ethics, and democracy. From Corpus Christi, Texas, he also serves as the press secretary and director of communications for student government. Mr. Benavides.
Let us take a few moments just to reflect on the words today that we have listened to. Heavenly Father, we thank you for gathering us here today to celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to reflect on the ways each of us can work to make this campus and our world a more welcoming and inclusive place for all. We ask that you guide us, especially this week, as we consider what it means to walk the walk, what it means for each one of us to take on the duty of creating a community where every member is respected and may flourish. We thank you for the gift of our humanity and the gift of diversity, which enriches our society. Each one of us, born in your image and likeness, are members of your family. In the words of Archbishop Jose Gomez, no matter where we are born, the color of our skin, or the language that we speak, we are all brothers and sisters. In recent times, we have painfully witnessed a rise in racist incidents and instances that have divided our community and our world. Help us to recognize when we have failed to uplift our sisters and brothers, when we did not stand against the sin of racism or other forms of hatred, and when we fail to call out systems that discriminate against and degrade members of our family. For these times, we ask forgiveness from you, O God, and from all our sisters and brothers. help us to turn to you and work towards a conversion of heart in our society and culture, so that we may heal the wounds of division, work to reform the structures of our society, and build an inclusive community for all. As we long for peace and justice, help us to accompany every member of our family, to celebrate one another, and to work towards a world where true love lives within each of us, so that we can truly live as sisters and brothers in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.
This brings our luncheon to a conclusion. Thank you all, and God bless.